Whether a flesh and blood prowler or a spectral nightmare, the gown man haunted the American South for half a century, a cousin to the woman in black of northern states. Today on American Strangeness, the gown man and the lady in black. We've previously covered Mobile, Alabama's decades-long haunting by the gown man and the similar hugging mollies who preceded him on a grander scale. Today we delve into the gown man's career as it spread further across the American South, the possible meaning behind the legend, and similarities with the prolific woman in black phantom. In mid-July 1920, a gown man frequented the neighborhood of Bradford Street between Renoir and Lebuse Streets in Biloxi, Mississippi. On dark nights, he roamed the local Jewish cemetery and the larger cemetery north of Renoir Street. There had been a similar specter spotted months earlier near Crawford Street and then Lee Street, but it was unclear if this was the same gown man. Residents chased this latest gown man and were unable to catch him. Biloxi Chief of Police Bills learned of the matter and tasked Officer Michel to search for the costumed interloper. The gown man was spotted the night of August 6th in a yard on East Washington Street. Residents, armed with pistols and shotguns, started out in search of the alleged man dressed in women's clothing. When the posse finally crossed paths with the gown man, they fired at least 15 shots. When the smoke cleared, the stranger was gone. The next morning, the searchers returned but found only the sheared tops of small pine trees and bushes they had blasted away with their bullets. Chief Bills soon after said he believed that imagination had much to do with the sightings of the gown man in various sections of Biloxi, terror spreading in whichever area he suddenly appeared. Police responded to a reported gown man sighting near Lee Street on August 17th, but found it was just a harmless old woman. She was dressed in a dark shirt with a white waist and an apron that made it appear she was wearing trousers under her dress. A similar report of a gown man during April 1914 in Tampa, Florida, turned out to be an elderly man in a hospital gown who had escaped from a local hospital. On February 11, 1921, Baton Rouge Police Captain Comeau and Frank Schoonmaker completed a thorough search of South Baton Rouge for the gown man, who was reported to be holding up black residents on the lower end of town and committing various robberies. The thief wore a white bonnet and a long, flowing white gown. He was said to creep stealthily through South Baton Rouge, sticking up victims in dark alleys. Captain Comeau states that the reports have been very much exaggerated, wrote the Baton Rouge State Times Advocate. After a 3-day search and after questioning practically everybody in the neighborhood where the gown man operates, it was found that no one had been held up and no one knows of anyone else who has been robbed by the mysterious man. This gown man, concluded the police, was merely a rumor fueled by excitement. Despite this conclusion, the gown man would return to Baton Rouge. Around 1930, a character known as the Domino Man struck the sparsely inhabited Gentilly suburb of New Orleans. Development had barely begun, so there were numerous empty lots that were thickly wooded and overgrown with tall weeds. The Domino Man, dressed in a white robe and hood, waited in the trees and dropped down into the lanes to chase little girls who were on their way to school, gesticulating wildly. After frightening the children, he would leap back into the trees with the agility of a monkey and vanish. Since the kids were always too frantic afterward to be certain of his size, a theory emerged that the Domino Man was actually a monkey that someone had dressed up as a practical joke. All witnesses swore the Domino Man never attacked or followed the children very far, content to depart once they screamed and ran. Armed men had pursued the Domino Man and fired directly at him, certain their bullets had hit their target, only for the troublemaker to reappear the next day unharmed. Some locals concluded that since most of the kids were Catholics, the Domino Man might be a Ku Klux Klan member. The KKK rode a nativist wave of anti-Catholicism during the 1920s, holding that Catholicism conflicted with democracy. They also believed that parochial schools encouraged separatism, which kept young Catholics from growing into loyal Americans. So apparently their way to solve that issue was by leaping at children from trees. In July 1934, the gown man targeted and robbed several African American citizens on the southern outskirts of Baton Rouge. The Morning Advocate described him as a very real bogeyman who dressed in an appallingly long black gown underneath which he carried a big pistol. Witnesses described the gown man as tall and fierce. He robbed a pedestrian of his cash on July 10th, then went on a spree the next night, stealing 5 cents from one victim and $4.85 from another, before frightening an elderly man almost into fits. A woman named Annabelle, a cook at a local boarding house, said she had been asking her employer to leave work early before it got dark. This followed an incident in which the gown man beat a man who didn't have any money nearly to death. A number of residents were barring their doors and remaining in their homes once evening fell. The gown man, however, met his match in a man named McCurr. The mugger cornered McCurr in a blind alley, pistol raised, but McCurr gave in to his instincts to run and plowed right through the gown man, knocking the criminal down and tromping him as he fled. Police and deputies, vowing to catch and unveil the disguised predator, responded to a call on July 17th, but the gown man had vanished by the time they arrived. The Baton Rouge Morning Advocate boldly declared on August 5th that, while the gown man has grown to be a spectral figure of terror, there still isn't such a person. Police had unraveled the sinister trail of the hooded hijacking terror and found there only a maze of hoodwinking with a bit of supernatural fear thrown in. Anxiety over the gown man persisted in Baton Rouge, with some young men courting serious legal trouble by carrying around guns for personal protection during their evening perambulations. When the gown man first appeared in Baton Rouge, garbed in either women's pajamas or a short robe, some residents feared he might be Gabriel Talley, who was wanted years earlier in Iberville Parish for the brutal murder of a woman with a cane knife. Son Talley, Gabriel's brother, was tried and sentenced to prison in Baton Rouge for a different killing. While on the lam, Gabriel had frequently visited relatives in Baton Rouge dressed as a woman to conceal his identity. Locals spotted him but were afraid to report his presence to police. But as more stories began to circulate and the stature of the desperado grew, he was said to be the ghost of a Baton Rouge police officer. Finally, he became just the gown man, the symbol of fear, wrote the Morning Advocate. According to Deputy Sheriff Ed Whitney, who beat the streets of South Baton Rouge seeking an answer to the mystery, there was an actual basis to the now pervasive tales of the gown man. It had started with the mugger who had been trampled by one of his intended victims, McCurr, the previous month. Dressed in a short robe or raincoat with a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, this particular gown man had successfully robbed 3 local black residents. But the man, who was also black, had been arrested after robbing a white man and was by then confined to jail at Edgard, so he couldn't be the gown man still bedeviling Baton Rouge. Whitney said it was possible that there had been additional hold-ups performed by other men dressed as the gown man. There was also a veritable maze of practical jokes. In one instance, a local resident hung a hat and an old cloak on a coat hanger, attached it to a string, and ran the string over a telegraph pole and then to some bushes. When a group approached, the practical joker yanked on the string and the spectral figure arose, jostling around and startling the pedestrians before vanishing when the operator released the string. Those who saw the flapping figure told a harrowing story of fierce pursuit and narrow escape, it was reported. The Big Easy also had its own gown man, who aroused curiosity and fear during the last couple months of 1934. Walter Furvis was accosted while walking alone in downtown New Orleans around midnight. On the vague edge of light cast by infrequent lampposts, Furvis saw against the dark wall the form of a darker figure, tall but shapeless, its head a monstrous angular shadow. It called out to Furvis, not in a ghostly croak, but in a low, truculent voice. Furvis whirled around and ran, looking back to see the dark figure flapping in pursuit. The chased man careened across vacant lots, following the shortcut to his home on Toro Street, between Hope and Dulles Streets. Hearing the gown man curse behind him, Furvis plunged into his house, slammed the door shut, and bolted it. "Gown man," he told his frightened wife between panting, "chased me all the way home." He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, Furvis recalled. He was dressed in a long black gown that touched his feet, and he had on a black sunbonnet that shaded his face so you couldn't see it at all. Furvis and his neighbors began observing 9 p.m. curfew on a long stretch, centering around Annette Street, back of town and in town, and between Claiborne and Broad Streets, as far in as Bourbon Street. Some New Orleans residents said that Furvis got off easy, as they knew others who had been caught, robbed, and beaten by the gown man. The fiend was said to lurk in the branches of sycamore trees that hung over a block of Bourbon Street near near Dorgenois, diving down onto passersby like a snakebird dives underwater, pinning his victim to the sidewalk. Neighbors recalled that the gown man had robbed a boy of $3.50 and then beat up another young man who didn't have any money. They said the gown man was not new to the neighborhood, having been seen for the previous 2 or 3 years, but only in winter. People run too fast when they are not tied up in overcoats, one resident suggested. The gown man was so prolific that New Orleans citizens assumed there must be more than one. He had been sighted in and outside town, in the tram on Orleans Street, farther out than Broad, almost at the river, even uptown. Among the suspected gown men was Chicken Charlie, a violent neighborhood criminal, although police had no recent record of him. A notorious brigand named Stack of Dollars was another suspect. The gown men were thought to inhabit and change their regalia in a vacant building on Prior Street, a former grocery. Marcel Fortune, who lived near the abandoned grocery, was walking past it at about 1:30 a.m. when he heard a voice call, "Fortune!" He looked down the dark alley next to the deserted building and saw a black man standing there in the shadows. "Where are you going?" the stranger inquired. "To work," answered Fortune. "No, you're not," the stranger retorted. "You're going to spend the night here with me." Fortune noticed a rolled-up bundle of black cloth at the stranger's side, and the mystery man smiled evilly. "I know you, but you don't know who I am," he said. "You didn't know I was a gown man, did you? And there are 3 more in the alley." Fortune then heard additional voices emanating from said alley. Just then, an older man came walking down the opposite sidewalk. Fortune called to him and ran across, the gown man shouting curses behind him, but not following. Fortune decided not to report the incident to police, out of fear that the gown man might retaliate. His older brother and a friend escorted him to his job at the Van Geffen Bakery moving forward. As real a threat as the gown man or men were to New Orleans residents, to police it was just a vague rumor that the African American community had developed amongst itself. Citizens began discussing going out armed and in groups to bring an end to the gown man's terror. A marauder nicknamed the Black Phantom, the Skirt Man, and Huggy Molly spread fear throughout the residential section of Montgomery, Alabama, bordering the State Normal School, today Alabama State University, in August 1943. Police authenticated 2 attacks on young women in their rooms. The Black Phantom entered the home of a teacher and slapped his daughter before fleeing. He then did the same to the daughter of Rufus Williams, manager of the New Deal Taxi Company. Descriptions of the Phantom varied, other than him being a black man who was focusing his mischief on members of the African American community. Huggy Molly eluded police and citizens for some time, but by August 11th had failed to appear for several days. Police suspected that a pursuing mob might have finally caught up to the Black Phantom and beaten him so severely that he was unable to continue his depredations. It was admitted, however, that however elusive the Phantom might be, the excitement and fear engendered by his 2 known acts were still present and very real, reported the Montgomery Advertiser. On the night of August 22nd, 2 men were trailing a masked man who suddenly turned around at the corner of Morgan and Stone Streets and fired a pistol at them. Police, who scoured the neighborhood for several hours afterward unsuccessfully, did not believe their quarry was the much-talked-about Skirt Man. The gown man was still active in New Orleans in 1945, at least within the rich traditions of the city's African-American denizens recorded by the Louisiana Writers Project. The gown man is tall and slim and wears a black cap and long black gown that reaches to the ground, said Olivia Collins, who resided at Camp Street near the levee of the Mississippi River. "He has a long black automobile, I done seen it, parked down at the bottom of the levee." Collins said that the gown man would approach women, but not if a man was around. She was uncertain of his race. "I know one thing," Collins concluded. "He's a real man and not no ghost." Other residents, however, were certain that the gown man was a phantom, driving his long, shiny car around the neighborhood of the levee. When he showed up in other sections of the city, he would drop out of the trees and send women fleeing and screaming for their lives and virtues. The gown man bears a striking resemblance to the woman in black, another wraith of the witching hour that prowled city streets across the United States during the same era. While these wispy thin ladies dressed head to toe in black mourning clothes were mostly spectral in nature, gliding along at inhuman speeds and dispersing suddenly into thin air, there was also a subset described as flesh and blood men in drag who accosted pedestrians. One such example was the Greenville Ghost, who bred hysteria throughout Jersey City, New Jersey in the winter of 1901 to 02. This ghost was more accurately described as a 6-foot-tall, muscular man dressed in deep black women's clothing with a hat and heavy veil. He grabbed and sometimes hugged lone women, and on some occasions was reported to rough them up. Any man who tried to interfere found themselves knocked senseless by the black ghost. Armed groups of citizens, including children, patrolled the streets looking for the prowler. Police finally revealed that they had identified the ghost as a local man who happened to be black and had a penchant for practical jokes. He was warned to cease his moonlight activities or face punishment. However, other reporting contradicted this identification, with police suggesting the whole story was either an exaggeration or a tall tale. I present this story to demonstrate how similar some of the Lady in Black stories were to the contemporaneous Gown Man. The woman in black appears to have frequently been a northeastern and midwestern U.S. phenomenon, occurring in communities that range greatly from diverse urban cities to rural coal mining towns. It is possible that the Gown Man might represent a unique southern variation of the same theme, one which arose predominantly in African American communities. It appears that Hugging Molly as a name for this entity evolved into the Gown Man, as they occupied the same region and presented similar dress and behaviors. An 1894 article in the Daily Inquirer of Columbus, Georgia, underlined the connection between the woman in black and Hugging Molly, writing, "Have you seen the Lady in Black? She is a ghost-like apparition of the Hugging Molly order, which flits around at night but seems intangible. A mortal dread has fallen upon the community, and many people are afraid to poke their heads outdoors after night. Who or what is the Lady in Black?" In part 2 of this series, we explored Abbeville, Alabama folk tales about Hugging Molly and the woman in black that might be connected. In an early report dating back to October 1867, the gender of the woman in black was already in question. Citizens of Milan, Ohio proposed that the witching hour phantom stalking their streets and evading capture, a 6-foot-tall, heavily built figure garbed in a black dress, might actually be a man. As pointed out by author and folklorist Chris Woodyard in his excellent articles about the woman in black, these stories appear to reflect societal norms of the era which viewed cross-dressing as an aberration that was not to be trusted. It didn't seem to matter whether the woman in black was a thief masquerading in disguise, or an innocent man who wished to express his sexual identity by appearing in public, dressed in women's clothing, albeit safely obscured by a veil. Starting in the mid-1800s, more than 40 cities across the nation passed laws criminalizing cross-dressing. Gender inappropriateness or variance was viewed as an amoral sickness and a public offense. Although this intolerant attitude is infrequently stated directly in stories about the woman in black, Hugging Molly, and Gown Man, it clearly underpins the fear of these boogeymen that links the various cases. Aspersions, however, are coded in the use of the term Hugging Molly to refer to cross-dressing prowlers and muggers. In 18th century London, Molly was a slur used for effeminate gay men, with Molly houses describing the clubs, taverns, inns, or coffee houses where they meet up in secret, according to the British Newspaper Archive. Homosexuality was punishable by law, with sentences ranging from standing in the pillory to jail time up to execution for sodomy, depending on the individual case and evidence. So, these venues offered a safe and private place for men to openly express their sexual identities and find acceptance, even though the Molly houses were at constant risk of being raided by police. Interestingly, a member of the folklore and mythology subreddit named Lean Bean 512 recalled hearing the term Huggin' Molly used colloquially in Mississippi, quote, as a put-down to describe a pathetic man like a pervert or a flasher. So, a pejorative use of the term appears to persist in the present day, possibly connected to the Hugging Molly legend. Unlike the woman in black, the Gown Man was infrequently ascribed as supernatural in nature. A corporeal man, sometimes an entire gang, was assumed to be masquerading in clothing of the opposite gender. The Gown Man was often feared as a robber, but like Hugging Molly before him, just as often engaged in mischief designed to scare, prank, and stupefy his victims. Whatever his crimes, the Gown Man was viewed as a legitimate threat and a reason to dread walking alone at night. Residents reacted with outrage, and police appear to have taken the reports seriously. While some of the news articles might contain journalistic sensationalism, they seem to have documented a mix of truth and mass hysteria, likely perpetuating the latter. Some of the Gown Men were arrested, named, and tried. Others just vanished into the void from which they came. Perhaps some criminals and pranksters were inspired by stories of Gown Men and dressed the part, or just took advantage of a concealing, obfuscating disguise. blending into the overall legend. Another woman in black of an earthly nature forlornly wandered the streets of Louisville, Kentucky in October 1868, ringing doorbells late at night and then failing to acknowledge in any way the confused residents who answered. While not suggested to be a disguised man, the Louisville Courier-Journal wrote, "She is very large, weighing 200 pounds perhaps, which precludes the idea that she is a ghost or spirit. She is clad in black from head to foot, a black bonnet covering up her face in the ancient style, a black veil hanging over the bonnet, a black shawl, a black dress. At a distance, she looks like a small-sized hearse." New Orleans did have its own woman in black for at least 6 months in 1869, somberly dressed as she strolled along the almost solitary desert of the levee from Lugger's Bay to the Morgan steamship landing. She promenaded like clockwork each night, appearing with the first shade of evening and vanishing before the first streak of daylight, even in inclement weather. The lady was tangible, distrustful police having arrested and brought her to the station at least a dozen times. She always gave police a different name, such as Virginia, Mary, or just Madam. The woman was thought to be perennially vigilant for a friend she expected to arrive on a ship, one which was unfortunately destined never to reach port. The woman in black offered no objection when other pedestrians chose to accompany her through the labyrinth of boxes and bales along the pier, and responded to queries with education, intelligence, and dignity. But at the first indication of day, she hastened off like a scared ghost. It is interesting to note that the New Orleans woman in black, like the gown man, was a strange living character rather than an outright phantasm. Maybe it is just coincidence, but these masked and costumed nocturnal marauders like the gown man share some commonalities with fictional superheroes like the Shadow and Batman that became popular during the first half of the 20th century. While standing on the opposite side of justice and preferring capes over dresses, such superheroes similarly cater to a public fascination with masked mystery men lurking on our city streets. But a more apt comparison is probably Candyman, memorably portrayed by Tony Todd, the serial killer of urban legend created by Clive Barker for the titular film series that began in 1992. In the films, Candyman emerges as a Bloody Mary-like specter of fear in the primarily African-American public housing project of Cabrini Green Homes in Chicago. The Candyman myth is presented through the films as a community reaction to generations of racial injustice and the murders of innocent black men. This includes Candyman himself, an African-American artist and son of a slave who was lynched in the late 1800s over his relationship with a white woman. Despite his origin, the feared Candyman kills residents of Cabrini Green when needed to keep his legend alive. Although the gown man was a much less lethal character, could he have developed in a similar way to the fictional Candyman within African-American communities across the American South? Enigmatic phantom assailants have materialized throughout the centuries to frighten communities for a period of time and then vanish back into the shadows, a phenomenon explored by Robert E. Bartholomew and Paul Weatherhead in their excellent 2024 book, Social Panics and Phantom Attackers. Fearsome fiends of this order have included Spring Heel Jack in 1830s England, Phantom Zeppelins in 1909 New Zealand, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Illinois in 1944, and the 2001 Monkey Man scare in New Delhi, India. These sagas are powerful human creations that reflect prominent fears in society at any given time, wrote Bartholomew and Weatherhead. The authors argue that these outbreaks do not derive from any external boogeyman, but from human imagination, fueled by our prevailing anxieties and deepest fears. For example, the Mad Gasser coincided with widespread press speculation that the failing German military might resort to chemical weapon attacks on American cities during the waning months of World War II. This existential fright was transposed into a local threat in which an unseen marauder was indiscriminately spraying poison gas into household windows across Mattoon. These mysterious assailants can evolve into urban myth and serve as cautionary tales, such as emphasizing the dangers to young women which lurk in a city's dark alleys at night. Although each social panic has a unique context and the form of the aggressor varies, there is a discernible pattern that plays out across time and the world. According to Bartholomew and Weatherhead, a community will unconsciously create a scapegoat for their problems in the form of evildoers, which unites them against a common enemy. Often, vigilante groups will form and patrol the streets, at times accusing innocent parties of being the mystery assailant. People, suddenly hyper-aware of their surroundings, begin seeing sinister threats all around them. Many residents will stay inside their homes, which impacts the local economy during the scare. Initially, authorities and the press add oxygen to the claims, investigating reports and taking them seriously. Due to the prevalence of incidents, they might assume there are multiple assailants operating in different areas. But after failing to find any supporting evidence and encountering misidentification and hoaxes, authorities and the same media that gave the claims credence begin to shed doubt on the whole phenomenon, even ridiculing sightings as flights of imagination. Further witnesses become hesitant to come forward, and the entire threat withers. Phantom assailants are not the territory of the weak-minded. Everyone is susceptible to self-deception, our perception and memory highly prone to influence by external pressures. It is just part of the human condition. Our eyes do not simply reflect what is in our environment. Our brains have a major influence on how we perceive the world and prime people to see what they expect to see, wrote Bartholomew in Weatherhead. As is evident in reviewing the multitude of cases explored in this series, the Gown Man, Hugging Molly, and the Woman in Black closely fit the patterns these authors identify in phantom assailants. Hugging Molly and the Gown Man first appeared in the decades following emancipation, and the timing closely parallels the rise of the KKK. Did fears of this hate group and its disguised members, not to mention everyday racism, blend with similar tropes of ghostly ladies and enshrouded thieves from elsewhere in the country? If so, why were so many of the Gown Men unmasked to reveal they were black men preying on their own communities? It suggests ever-present anxieties couched in the familiar, a menace that is close to home, material and frightening, yet also less dangerous, more vague and more controllable than an outside threat. The Woman in Black, Hugging Molly, and the Gown Man all symbolize a general fear and warning of walking alone in the dark through urbanized areas. Yet, the latter two entities appear to uniquely reflect the trauma of African Americans who were establishing themselves as freed individuals in a South that had within living memory completely oppressed them. Now, before we close this out, let me just say I am presenting this research as a 21st century white man and amateur folklorist who lives in the northeastern U.S. I am certainly open to hearing differing opinions and expertise from those with a more educated perspective on race relations in the late 19th century and early 20th century America. I began writing and preparing this lengthy video series after stumbling upon a reference to the mysterious Gown Man in an article about the monster of Marmot Street. Once I realized it was a prolific character who appeared in news and lore from the American South over the course of several decades, I decided it was worth documenting and compiling research on the phenomenon. My topmost goal is the preservation of American history and folklore that has mostly been forgotten, and to hopefully provide some valuable context about the era and the place from which it originated. It would have been dishonest to ignore the fact that these stories center mostly on African American communities in the American South during a time fraught with racial tension in the decades following the Civil War. Perhaps I am wrong about a visceral connection between the Gown Man and the KKK, although some contemporary articles also drew that comparison. In my opinion, the Gown Man and Hugging Molly are unique pieces of Southern folklore, likely connected to some real incidents, best remembered, understood, and even celebrated for their uniqueness in the present day. I hope you agree.